Well, it's time. You've overcome your writer's block, you've silenced your inner critic, and you've written every day to complete your work. And you've assembled your writer's community, whether it's in a classroom, through the internet, or just a collection of friends. Now, it's time to get feedback. And perhaps more dauntingly, to implement the feedback and make changes to the piece that you've spent hours and hours working on. In this extra long lesson to end off this first unit, we discuss how to give, receive, and implement feedback to begin your revision process. Welcome back once again to WordSea, guidance for writers new and veteran. Let me start off by sharing a fact about writing. That writing is rewriting. Editing is an essential part of the creative process. And you should get used to the idea that anything you put down on paper can be changed, moved, expanded, or removed altogether. That fact can sting, especially to us who spend years working on whole books, but once you're used to the idea, it can actually liberate rather than intimidate you. Once you realize that your writing is malleable, you never have to feel constrained by what you've written. If something isn't working for you, all roads are potentially open. Remember what we discussed in the lesson on writer's block. Hitting your head against a solid wall is an inefficient way to problem solve. Letting yourself go around the problem saves you a lot of time and stress. So to really kick things off, let's discuss the most effective way I've found to give creative writing feedback. I'd encourage you to suggest this method to your workshoppers and to use it yourself when workshopping others. Now, when you're soliciting feedback, it's important to remember that you might not be the expert on your own piece. We're often down in the weeds as we write, not really seeing the whole forest through the trees, We may know that something somewhere isn't right in our piece, but it can be hard to pinpoint where we're struggling. So, while I don't discourage giving your workshoppers suggestions of elements to pay close attention to, I wouldn't limit their feedback either. They might find an issue or a bright spot within your piece that you might have never noticed. Now, in all of the creative writing classes I've taught, I've used the describe, praise, question method of feedback, first shown to me by Dr. Kenneth Cook at Iowa State University. Though, I like to add one more step to this method, which is where I'll start, the step of ascertaining. When you're workshopping a piece, I encourage reading it through twice, and to write in the margins as well. Record your moments of confusion or surprise or enjoyment. Now, after your first read-through, you should ascertain the nature of the piece and its pressure points. This process depends on your ability to ask questions of a piece. Remember what we discussed in the GIF community. You should treat the pieces you're workshopping as though they were finished pieces of quality literature, no matter what stage of development they're actually in. So you should ask what the piece is trying to achieve and what it wants you to feel. So an example might be, during a scene where the work's main character escapes from her captors by using misdirection and confusion, you might ascertain that the piece is trying to convince the reader that the main character is more brains than bronze and can think quickly on her feet, while her kidnappers aren't particularly good at their jobs. Now, what you may come to realize is that your reading of the main character in this scene was totally on point for what the writer was trying to communicate. But what you read into her kidnappers might actually be totally unintended. So, ascertaining what the piece is trying to do and trying to get you to feel and what it wants you to learn about characters or setting is the first step in giving quality text-centric feedback that will help the piece improve. The second stage of workshopping is then description. Describing should be done after your second reading of the piece. Here, you'll describe everything that happens in the piece. Who the characters are, what the relationships are to each other, what happens in the piece, what the setting or time period is, and any world building going on. This part of the process is actually always the most controversial with my students. After all, why bother describing something that the author already knows? Well, consider you just saw a movie with a friend. Then you go and ask your friend what they thought of the movie, and they tell you that they didn't really like the part where the main character left home after an argument with his parents. They say to you that they felt that scene came out of nowhere and was hard to believe, but they were looking at their phone during the previous scene that had set up this critical argument. So you likely won't believe your friend's appraisement of the movie's quality if they weren't even really paying attention through all of it. So by describing the writing, you can show that you've done the work to understand the piece in depth, and then you can compare what you ascertained previously with what's actually on the page. Plus, if you simply didn't catch that, if you, say, simply didn't even catch that there were two characters that were supposed to be related, or you didn't catch the time period of the piece's setting, that can actually help the author understand that they may not have emphasized those elements correctly, and then in their next drafts they will up that emphasis. Now, the next two steps of workshopping are a little bit more familiar, praising and questioning. But when you praise, it's key to focus on what is working well, not just what you liked. Of course, if you really loved something, you should say so, but if you've ascertained what the piece is going for, you should prioritize praising how well it's actually succeeding at its goals. It also helps to demonstrate how and why an aspect of the piece is working, so I encourage you to actually cite or point to specific lines or passages that were enjoyable or showed the piece achieving its goals. And something I often say to my students about praising is that even if you don't necessarily like a piece, that doesn't mean that you can't praise it for achieving its intentions. The final stage of workshopping, questioning, is where criticism usually lives during a workshop. But I find that simply airing grievances with a piece, especially if they're phrased as, "I didn't like this" or "I didn't like that," can reduce the workshop process down to fault finding. So instead, I recommend asking yet more questions. Take the earlier example about the incompetent kidnappers. Instead of critiquing the piece by saying something like, "I didn't like how stupid the kidnappers were," try, "Why are the kidnappers so bad at their jobs?" It's entirely possible, especially when workshopping chapters of novels, that the author actually wanted their kidnappers to look incompetent because of a key plot detail to be explored later on. But it's actually more likely that the writer themselves will wonder why the kidnappers appear so bad at their jobs, and they'll improve their next drafts by adding in some craftier criminals. And then after posing your questions, feel free to offer some suggestions to the author about how to answer some of those questions. Of course, those suggestions should be taken or left at the author's discretion, but you never know how a suggestion might spark the author's imagination. And something key about making suggestions of a piece: always play the piece where it lies. Even if you love, say, science fiction and you think every story could be improved with spaceships and cyborgs, if the piece doesn't seem fit to facilitate spaceships and cyborgs, it's better to leave that suggestion out. So now you have your feedback. You've read what was written for you, and you've had productive discussions on it. So now what? Well, now you have to incorporate what you've been given while keeping true to your vision, even if that vision changes throughout the editing process, which it often will. So here are a few strategies to help with the revision process. First is the side-by-side method. This is most useful if you want to make sweeping changes to your piece at both a line and storyline level. First, reread all of your feedback, all of the ascertainments and praise, all of the questions and suggestions. Now, open your story in one document and place it on one side of your screen. Then open a blank document on the other side of the screen. And note, if you're fond of physical writing, just position your story opposite a blank sheet of paper. And then, and I'm being serious here, rewrite your entire story line by line, adding, cutting, clarifying, and removing as you go. You will be amazed how much cleaner your sentences and passages become when you approach them this way. Because this method gives you a chance to see the forest through the trees by approaching your story from the outside with a fresh set of eyes. A second method, if your piece is shorter or if a particular scene is really bothering you, is the out loud method, and this is kind of what it sounds like. Read your entire piece or scene out loud. This method is best for clarifying confusing passages or better understanding a character's voice. Also, you'll be able to more clearly hear if a scene is dragging or deserves some paring down. I actually use this out loud method every time I record one of these videos, where I have to do 2 or 3 full recordings before I'm actually happy with it, because every time I do a recording, I find that I can remove certain sections or clarify certain sections. So the process really does work, especially if you are working with smaller pieces. The third method is most useful when trying to better understand your characters. This is the voice-only method. The setup is similar to the side-by-side method, where you position a blank document next to your current draft, but try to focus on a particular scene when using this method. Now rewrite the entire scene line by line using dialogue only. By replacing all description and action with dialogue, you'll come to better understand your character's voice. Then you can choose the choicest of lines and incorporate them back into your story. If you have experience writing scripts, this whole process should sound pretty familiar to you. I find that this method helps a lot when my scenes become overstuffed with description and the characters are starting to get lost. The final method I have for you today is the self-reflection method. This method is more useful when you're working with larger, more complex pieces like novels where it can be hard to zoom out and see the whole picture. Also, you won't have to rewrite an entire book like my first method suggested. The self-reflection method requires you to have on hand a whiteboard or large sheet of paper. Firstly, list out your intentions with your work. What are you trying to accomplish artistically? What are the work's primary themes? What is the work's aesthetic? This is often determined by elements like point of view, setting, time period, and descriptions. Finally, what kinds of emotions would you like your audience to feel at various pressure points throughout your work? And to clarify, a pressure point is really any place in a story where there's particular emphasis being made. So that might be a clash of characters, or a certain revelation, or a piece of a mystery being dropped in the character's path. Now, it's likely that your workshoppers have actually mentioned some of these intentions already when ascertaining your work, but if you find holes during this section, for instance, if you don't have an artistic goal or you're unsure about what you'd like the audience to feel at key points, see to those first. Knowing what you want out of your work will ensure that your piece evolves in an agreeable way. After stating your work's goals, list every primary and secondary character as well as every key event, and link them to each other and to your work's overall intentions. So, what, say, is a character bringing to your primary themes? Or, for instance, having a 40-page battle scene is cool and all, but if we're not seeing the characters involved in the battle change, either because they're finding new dimensions within themselves or they see new dimensions in the world around them, and if the battle isn't contributing to the themes or the artistic goal that define your work, well, then the entire sequence may need some serious large-scale revisions. And then these revisions can come about by using the other methods previously discussed, going scene by scene or even line by line until the major events or characters in question come more in line with your creative goals. And then you just repeat this method for other major events or pressure points until the whole work feels more in sync with your overall intentions. Finally, I'll turn to what Roy Peter Clark has to say about editing. So Clark actually has a background in newspaper and essay writing, so he's well acquainted with the challenges of cutting, adding, and changing. In his chapter, Cut Big, Then Small, Clark starts off by saying that as we write, we can fall in love with our own creations, which I'm sure a lot of us could attest to. And he cautions against us becoming too attached to what we make. He even encourages that we become ruthless with our work, cutting and sharpening with what he calls cold-hearted judgment. Clark argues that the most potent editing comes from reduction rather than compression. He urges writers to excise all passages that don't support the piece's goals, and his most common targets for editing include adverbs that intensify rather than modify, like extremely or completely, prepositional phrases that repeat the obvious, like in the story or in the article, phrases that grow on verbs, like seems to or tries to, abstract nouns that hide active verbs, like observation instead of observes, and restatements, like a sultry humid afternoon, so redundant descriptions. And we'll actually be hearing a lot more of this kind of advice from Clark when we begin Unit 2, which will cover more of the nitty-gritty mechanics of writing. Our first lesson in the second unit will actually explore micro-level word choice and how to make every sentence pop with energy. Speaking of, with this final bit of revision advice from Clark, this marks the end of this lesson and this first unit. Now, you are all better equipped to begin, continue, and even bring to an end the writing process. Now remember that editing shouldn't be a chore. Your third or even 18th draft is as much writing as your first one. Once you come to realize that, writing can become less of a goal to meet and more of a constantly evolving series of growths and explorations. So don't be afraid to return to an old work with some Clarkian cold judgment, or to reimagine a piece from the ground up by rewriting it a line at a time. Because if writing is rewriting, then editing is creating. And always remember this too, your writing community is a gift community, so help out your fellow writers by delivering intensive, high effort, high payoff, tech-centric feedback, and your community will return the favor. Of course, I can give you all the advice I can think of and share with you all the strategies in the world, but creativity is always in your hands. So I encourage you to take all that you've learned from these lessons and go forth into the wide open WordSea with confidence. See you all next time.